The whistle shrieked through the Kansas darkness as Pearl Hartwell adjusted her conductor's cap for the third time that evening. October 1932 had brought early frost to the prairie, and the Pennsylvania Railroad's night express carried its usual cargo of desperate souls fleeing west. She stood at the rear platform of Car 3, watching the depot lights of Topeka fade into memory, while her left hand trembled against her uniform skirt. The tremor had started 6 months ago, just after her 20th birthday. A nervous tic that made her fingers dance without permission. Railroad regulations demanded steady hands for ticket punching, baggage handling, and emergency procedures. Any visible weakness could mean immediate dismissal, and Pearl needed this job more than she needed pride or comfort. Miss Hartwell. The voice belonged to conductor Samuel Morrison, a man whose 43 years had carved deep lines around eyes that missed nothing. He emerged from the first-class car with his brass lantern swinging, casting amber shadows across his weathered face. Passenger manifest shows 27 souls aboard tonight. Count them twice before we reach Denver. Pearl nodded, tucking her shaking hand behind her back. Yes, sir. Already started the first round. Good. Morrison's gaze lingered on her face, searching for signs of the weakness he suspected lurked beneath her professional exterior. Remember the company directive from last month. Any irregularities in passenger counts get reported to me directly. Not to the station master, not to your union representative, not to anyone else. Clear? Crystal clear, sir. Morrison stepped closer, close enough that Pearl could smell tobacco and coffee on his breath. The railroad's reputation depends on absolute accuracy in our records. Passengers board, passengers disembark, passengers pay their fares. Nothing more complicated than that. We don't speculate about where they go or why they leave. We count heads and punch tickets. The tremor in Pearl's left hand intensified, spreading up her wrist like electricity through copper wire. She clenched her fist and pressed it harder against her spine. Understood, sir. See that it stays that way. Morrison turned toward the locomotive, then paused. One more thing, Miss Hartwell. The gentleman in compartment 7. A paid extra for privacy. No meal service, no turn-down service, no interruptions whatsoever. He's traveling under railroad protection, if you catch my meaning. Pearl didn't catch his meaning, but she nodded anyway. Railroad protection could mean anything from a federal marshal to a witness fleeing gangster vengeance. Either way, Compartment 7A would remain locked and silent for the duration of the journey. The train rounded a curve, wheels singing against steel rails as the night express gathered speed through the heartland. Pearl began her first official count, moving through the cars with practiced efficiency despite her trembling hand. Car 1 held 8 passengers, mostly men in worn suits clutching cardboard suitcases. Car 2 carried 7 souls, including a young mother with twin babies who couldn't stop crying. Car 3 housed the mystery passenger in 7A plus 5 others in standard accommodations. 27 total, just as Morrison had said. Pearl completed her second count an hour later as the train crossed into Colorado territory. The numbers matched perfectly, but something felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. The passenger in compartment 7A hadn't made a sound since departure, not even when the babies in car 2 screamed for 20 minutes straight. Most travelers would have complained, or at least knocked on the wall, but 7A remained silent as a tomb. She knocked gently on the compartment door during her third round. Sir? Everything comfortable in there? Can I bring you coffee or sandwiches? No response. Not even the creak of bed springs or rustle of clothing. Pearl pressed her ear to the door and heard nothing except the train's rhythmic clatter. According to Morrison's instructions, passengers under railroad protection required absolute privacy, but they also required basic safety checks. Company regulations demanded wellness verification every 4 hours on overnight journeys. The dilemma twisted in her chest like barbed wire. Follow Morrison's direct orders and risk a passenger's health, or perform her regulatory duties and risk Morrison's wrath. Either choice could end her career, but only one could end a human life. She made her decision and tried the door handle. Locked tight, just as expected. Pearl pulled out her master keyring, fingers shaking so badly that brass clinked against brass in a nervous symphony. The tremor had worsened throughout the evening, spreading from her left hand to both arms now. The key turned smoothly, and compartment 7A's door swung open to reveal an empty berth with undisturbed bedding. No passenger, no luggage, no sign that anyone had ever occupied the space. Pearl's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the pristine compartment. The railroad had collected payment for 7A. Morrison had specifically mentioned the passenger, but nobody existed inside. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Had the passenger fallen from the train? Slipped away at an unscheduled stop? Been removed by force during her breaks? "Miss Hartwell!" Morrison's voice cut through her confusion like a blade. He stood in the corridor behind her, lantern held high and eyes blazing with cold fury. "What exactly are you doing in compartment 7A?" Pearl's trembling intensified until her entire body shook with nervous energy. "Wellness check, sir. Company regulations require following direct orders from your conductor." Morrison stepped into the empty compartment and closed the door behind them, sealing them in private darkness broken only by his lantern's glow. "I specifically told you that 7A required no service of any kind. But sir, there's nobody here. The passenger is missing." Morrison's expression didn't change, but his knuckles whitened around the lantern handle. "The passenger in 7A paid for transportation from Topeka to Denver. Our records show one passenger boarded, and our records will show one passenger disembarked. The railroad takes payment and provides service. Nothing else matters." Pearl's mind struggled to process his words. "You're saying we should falsify the passenger count?" "I'm saying we follow company policy regarding privacy and discretion." Morrison moved closer until she could see every line in his weathered face. "Some passengers prefer to remain invisible during their journey. The railroad accommodates such preferences when appropriate payments are made." The truth hit Pearl like a physical blow. The passenger in 7A had never existed. At least not in any conventional sense. Someone had paid the railroad to create a fictional traveler, complete with reservation records and conductor instructions. But who would pay for a ghost passenger, and why? "Sir, I need to understand what's happening here. If we're carrying phantom passengers, then—" Morrison grabbed her shoulder with surprising strength, his fingers digging into her uniform fabric. "Miss Hartwell, you need to understand that asking questions above your pay grade leads to unemployment. The Night Express carries whoever boards and delivers them wherever they need to go. Sometimes those passengers value discretion more than comfort. Sometimes they pay extra for services that don't appear in our standard catalog." Pearl tried to pull away, but Morrison's grip tightened. Her left hand shook violently now, the tremor visible even in the lantern's dim light. "Are you threatening me, sir? I'm educating you about railroad hospitality. We serve all kinds of travelers on the Night Express, including some who prefer to remain unofficial. Your job is to count the passengers we want counted and ignore the ones we don't. Can you handle that responsibility, Miss Hartwell?" The compartment felt smaller with each passing second, walls pressing inward like a closing fist. Pearl realized that Morrison's education extended far beyond passenger manifests and company policy. He was teaching her about survival in a world where asking the wrong questions could destroy everything she'd worked to build. But her mind kept returning to the empty berth and undisturbed bedding. If 7A had never contained a real passenger, then who had paid for the ghost reservation? And if the railroad was comfortable falsifying records for one compartment, how many other phantom passengers rode the Night Express? "I can handle the responsibility, sir. she said finally, hating herself for the capitulation but knowing she had no choice. Morrison released her shoulder and opened the compartment door. Excellent. I knew you were smart enough to understand the situation. Now, let's discuss your final passenger count for tonight's journey. They stepped back into the corridor, where other passengers might witness their conversation. Morrison's voice returned to its normal professional tone, but his eyes remained hard as steel. 27 passengers departed Topeka tonight, he said clearly. 27 passengers will disembark in Denver tomorrow morning. The railroad's reputation depends on accurate record-keeping, Miss Hartwell. I trust you'll remember that when filing your report. Pearl nodded. Her trembling hand clenched so tightly that her fingernails drew blood from her palm. 27 passengers, including one ghost in compartment 7A. The mathematics of deception had become part of her job description, whether she wanted it or not. But as Morrison walked toward the locomotive car, Pearl made her own decision about record-keeping. She would count every passenger on every journey, including the ones who weren't supposed to exist. If the Night Express was carrying ghosts, she intended to document every phantom soul. The train whistled through the Colorado darkness while Pearl returned to her rounds, now watching for passengers who might not be passengers, and counting heads that might not need counting. Her left hand continued to shake with nervous energy. But for the first time all evening, the tremor felt like a source of power rather than weakness. Something was wrong on the Night Express. Something that went far deeper than phantom passengers and falsified manifests. Pearl intended to discover the truth, even if it meant risking everything she'd worked to achieve. The railroad wanted her to count 27 souls, but she planned to count every shadow and silence, too. The hunt for invisible passengers had begun. Dawn broke over the Colorado mountains as the Night Express pulled into Denver Union Station. But Pearl Hartwell had not slept. She stood at her post beside the conductor's platform, official clipboard in hand, watching 26 passengers disembark into the morning chaos of porters and steam. Her left hand trembled against the metal railing as she counted each departing soul, knowing that her official report would list 27. Conductor Morrison appeared at her elbow with his own paperwork, brass buttons gleaming in the early sunlight. Final count, Miss Hartwell. 26 passengers disembarked, sir. Pearl kept her voice steady despite the nervous energy crackling through her chest. Same as boarded, minus the gentleman from compartment 7A who apparently left during the night. Morrison's pen paused above his manifest sheet. The official count shows 27 passengers completed the journey from Topeka to Denver. I suggest you recheck your mathematics. Pearl met his gaze directly, her trembling hand now gripping the clipboard with white knuckles. I counted carefully, sir. 26 real people stepped off this train. Real people. Morrison's voice carried dangerous undertones as he stepped closer. Miss Hartwell, are you suggesting that some passengers are less real than others? The question hung in the morning air between them, while depot workers loaded baggage and passengers hurried toward the station building. Pearl realized that Morrison was giving her one final chance to accept the railroad's version of reality before taking more drastic action. No, sir, she said finally. I'm suggesting that my count might have been affected by fatigue. 27 passengers completed the journey, just as you said. Morrison smiled, but the expression held no warmth. Fatigue can certainly cause counting errors. Perhaps you need a few days of rest to recover from such a demanding shift. The threat was clear as mountain air. Report the phantom passenger or lose her job entirely. Pearl nodded and made the required notation on her clipboard, officially documenting 27 souls where only 26 existed. The mathematics of survival had forced her into complicity with whatever scheme the railroad was operating. Excellent, Morrison said. Now, Miss Hartwell, I have another assignment for you. The railway company has decided to promote you to senior conductor on the Night Express, effective immediately. Pearl blinked in surprise. Sir? I've only been working passenger service for 8 months. Your dedication and discretion have been noted by management. Senior conductors receive additional compensation and expanded responsibilities. Morrison handed her a new badge bearing the railroad's Eagle insignia. You'll be working directly under my supervision on special passenger assignments. The promotion felt more like a golden cage than advancement. Pearl pinned the new badge to her uniform jacket, while her mind raced through implications. Senior conductors handled sensitive cargo, witnessed confidential transactions, and signed documents that could never be questioned. Morrison was buying her silence with rank and responsibility. Thank you for the opportunity, sir. Don't thank me yet. Morrison consulted his pocket watch as the station bells chimed 8 o'clock. Your first special assignment begins tonight. We're carrying a federal prisoner from Denver to Chicago, along with his escort detail. Absolute secrecy required. Pearl's stomach clenched with fresh anxiety. Federal prisoners meant marshals, judges, and congressional hearings if anything went wrong. What kind of prisoner, sir? The kind that doesn't officially exist until he reaches Chicago. Morrison closed his watch with a sharp click. Compartments 4A through 4C have been reserved for the transport. You'll provide meal service and security checks according to a very specific schedule that I'll give you before departure. The pattern was becoming clear. The Night Express specialized in moving people who needed to disappear from one location and reappear in another without leaving traces in between. Phantom passengers, federal prisoners, and probably worse things that Morrison hadn't mentioned yet. Sir, may I ask why you're trusting me with such sensitive assignments? Morrison's smile turned predatory. Because you've already proven your ability to count passengers correctly, Miss Hartwell. 27 souls departed Topeka last night, and 27 souls arrived in Denver this morning. Your mathematics are impeccable. Pearl understood the message. She had become complicit in the railroad's deception, making her a trusted employee rather than a potential threat. The promotion wasn't recognition of her abilities, it was insurance against her conscience. The morning shift change brought new crew members aboard the Night Express, including a replacement conductor named Jake Brennan, who looked young enough to be Pearl's brother. He approached with eager enthusiasm and a spotless uniform that screamed inexperience. Miss Hartwell? Jake Brennan, reporting for passenger service. I heard you got promoted to senior conductor. Congratulations. Pearl studied his face, searching for signs of the knowledge that seemed to infect everyone connected to the Night Express. But Brennan's eyes held nothing except genuine excitement about his new assignment. Thank you, Brennan. Have you worked special transport before? No, ma'am. This is my first assignment on the overnight routes. Been working local freight for 2 years, but passenger service is where the real money lives. Brennan lowered his voice conspiratorially. Word is the Night Express pays bonuses for discretion and accuracy. Pearl's left hand began trembling again as she realized that Brennan was exactly where she had been 8 months ago. Eager and naive and completely unprepared for what the railroad expected from its employees. Morrison was grooming another accomplice, someone young and desperate enough to accept phantom passengers as normal business practice. Brennan, let me give you some advice about working the Night Express. Count every passenger twice, follow orders exactly, and never ask questions about compartments marked as private transportation. Private transportation? Federal prisoners, witness protection, corporate executives who need to travel without publicity. The railroad handles special passengers who pay extra for invisibility. Pearl hated herself for lying, but Brennan's survival might depend on accepting the deception before learning the truth. Morrison returned with a sealed envelope bearing Pearl's name in official typeface. Your assignment details, Miss Hartwell. Study them carefully and destroy the documents before tonight's departure. Pearl took the envelope, feeling its weight like lead in her trembling fingers. Whatever was written inside would bind her deeper into the railroad's conspiracy, making her essential to operations she didn't fully understand. The rest of the morning passed in routine maintenance and passenger boarding for the day routes, but Pearl's mind kept returning to compartment 7A and its missing occupant. Someone had paid the railroad to transport a ghost from Topeka to Denver, but ghosts didn't need train tickets or berth reservations. The phantom passenger represented something more complex than simple fraud. During her lunch break, Pearl walked through Denver's business district until she found the Western Union Telegraph office. She sent a coded message to her cousin Martha in Kansas City, using their childhood nickname system to communicate without detection. Buttercup, playing new games with invisible friends. Rules more complicated than expected. May need family visit soon. Moonbeam. The telegraph operator, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, read the message without expression and quoted the transmission fee. Pearl paid with coins from her promotion bonus, knowing that any communication outside railroad channels carried risks she couldn't calculate. That evening, as the Night Express prepared for departure to Chicago, Pearl opened Morrison's sealed envelope in the privacy of her quarters. The assignment details made her blood run cold. 3 federal marshals would board with a prisoner identified only as Subject 17. The prisoner required constant supervision but could not be acknowledged in passenger manifests or station records. Meal delivery would occur at precisely 11:30 p.m., 1:30 a.m., and 5:30 a.m. through a specialized slot that maintained security protocols. No visual contact with Subject 17 was permitted under any circumstances. The bottom of the page contained a handwritten note in Morrison's careful script. Subject 17 represents a significant revenue opportunity for the railroad. His successful transport to Chicago will result in additional bonuses for all participating crew members. Failure to maintain absolute secrecy will result in immediate termination and possible criminal charges for violation of federal security protocols. Pearl folded the documents and struck a match, watching Morrison's instructions turn to ash in her wash basin. But the words remained burned into her memory, along with the growing certainty that the Night Express was operating far outside legal boundaries. The passenger boarding process began at sunset, with Pearl and Brennan checking tickets and directing travelers to their assigned accommodations. Regular passengers filled cars 1 through 3, while Car 4 remained cordoned off with official railroad tape marked Private Charter. At precisely 9:15 p.m., 3 men in dark suits boarded through the rear entrance and disappeared into Car 4 without registering at Pearl's checkpoint. She caught a glimpse of handcuffs and heard the distinctive click of compartment locks engaging, but followed instructions to ignore the federal transport entirely. Morrison appeared at her shoulder as the Night Express pulled away from Denver Union Station. "Everything proceeding smoothly, Miss Hartwell?" "Yes, sir. Regular passenger count is 18 souls, plus the private charter in Car 4 that doesn't require official documentation." "Excellent." Morrison handed her a ring of specialized keys marked with federal insignia. "Subject 17's meal service begins in 2 hours. Remember the protocols exactly as written." Pearl accepted the keys while her left hand shook with anticipation and dread. Whatever waited in Car 4 represented another step deeper into the railroad's shadow operations, another compromise with forces she couldn't understand or control. But as the Night Express gathered speed through the Colorado darkness, Pearl made a decision that would change everything. She would follow Morrison's protocols exactly, but she would also document every detail of Subject 17's transport in her private journal. If the railroad was moving federal prisoners without official records, someone needed to maintain an accurate account of their crimes. The hunt for truth was about to become far more dangerous than counting phantom passengers. The Night Express cut through Kansas wheat fields at 11:25 p.m. when Pearl Hartwell approached Car 4 with Subject 17's first meal delivery. Her left hand trembled against the specialized key ring as she unlocked the service corridor that separated regular passenger accommodations from federal transport. The familiar railroad sounds, wheels on steel, steam pressure, coupling chains, seemed muffled in this section, as if the government's presence had deadened even mechanical noise. Marshal Thomas Kearney stood guard outside compartment 4B, his weathered face illuminated by a single electric bulb that cast harsh shadows across official features. He was built like a tree trunk, solid and immovable, with eyes that tracked Pearl's approach like a predator watching prey. "Meal service," Pearl announced quietly, holding up the covered tray that contained standard railroad fare: beef stew, bread, coffee, and apple pie. Kearney nodded but didn't move aside. "Identification." Pearl showed him her senior conductor badge and the specialized keys Morrison had provided. Kearney examined both items carefully before stepping back to allow access to the meal slot built into compartment 4B's reinforced door. The slot was larger than Pearl had expected, wide enough to pass through a dinner tray, but narrow enough to prevent anything larger from moving in either direction. She slid the tray through the opening and heard it clatter against metal flooring inside the compartment. "Subject 17, Kearney called through the door. "Meal service. You have 15 minutes to eat before collection." No response came from inside the compartment, but Pearl heard the subtle sounds of movement. Footsteps, the scrape of a chair, the clink of utensils against dishware. Subject 17 was alive and conscious, whatever else he might represent. "Ma'am," Kearney said quietly, "federal regulations require that you remain here until meal completion. Security protocols." Pearl settled against the corridor wall, trying to appear professional, while her mind raced through questions she couldn't ask. Why would a federal prisoner require such elaborate transport arrangements? Most criminals traveled in regular custody, handcuffed to marshals on public trains with standard documentation. Subject 17's invisible status suggested something far more sensitive than ordinary crime. Through the meal slot, she could hear Subject 17 eating with deliberate precision, knife-cutting meat, spoon stirring coffee, measured chewing that suggested either excellent manners or careful control. Not the desperate gulping she would expect from a dangerous criminal. "Marshal Kearney," Pearl ventured, "how long have you been transporting federal prisoners?" Kearney's expression didn't change, but his hand moved closer to the revolver holstered at his hip. "Miss Hartwell, federal transport operations are classified information. I suggest you focus on your railroad duties and avoid unnecessary curiosity." The warning was clear, but Pearl's journalist instincts, inherited from her father's newspaper background, pushed her to probe further. "Of course, sir. I'm just trying to provide the best possible service. How many meals will Subject 17 require during the journey?" 3 meals as specified in your instructions. Nothing more, nothing less." Kearney checked his pocket watch. "Time remaining? 8 minutes. Pearl nodded and pretended to study her duty roster while actually observing Kearney's behavior. The marshal was nervous about something, frequently glancing toward compartments 4A and 4C as if expecting trouble from multiple directions. His left eye twitched whenever footsteps echoed from the regular passenger cars, and his breathing had the shallow rhythm of sustained tension. Subject 17 finished eating with mechanical efficiency, sliding the empty tray back through the meal slot exactly 14 minutes after Pearl had delivered it. She collected the dishware and noticed that every scrap of food had been consumed, even crumbs wiped clean with bread. Either the prisoner was exceptionally hungry or exceptionally disciplined. "Thank you for the meal service," came a voice from inside compartment 4B. The words were spoken with educated diction and careful pronunciation, nothing like the rough speech Pearl expected from a federal criminal. Kearney's hand dropped to his revolver grip. "Subject 17, you are not authorized for conversation with railroad personnel." "My apologies, Marshal. I was simply expressing gratitude for excellent service." Pearl's blood turned cold as she recognized something familiar in Subject 17's voice. A slight accent that reminded her of her college professors, men who spoke multiple languages and understood complex political theories. This wasn't a common criminal being transported for trial. This was someone educated and intelligent, someone whose crime might involve ideas rather than violence. "Ma'am," Kearney said firmly, "your meal service is complete. Federal regulations require your immediate departure from the transport area." Pearl gathered the empty tray and moved toward the service corridor exit, but paused when she heard muffled conversation from compartment 4A, two male voices speaking in rapid, urgent tones that suggested disagreement about something important. She couldn't make out specific words, but the emotional undertones were clear: fear, anger, and desperate negotiation. "Miss Hartwell," Kearney's voice cut through her eavesdropping. "Federal transport areas are restricted to authorized personnel only." Pearl hurried through the service corridor and back into regular passenger territory, her mind spinning with new information about the Night Express's cargo. Subject 17 wasn't just a federal prisoner. He was someone whose transport required 3 marshals, specialized compartments, and absolute secrecy. The kind of person whose existence threatened powerful interests. She found Conductor Morrison in the observation car, reviewing paperwork by lamplight while regular passengers slept in their berths. He looked up as she approached, his weathered face showing the strain of managing operations that existed outside normal railroad business. "Meal service completed successfully?" Morrison asked. "Yes, sir. Subject 17 received his dinner and expressed appreciation for the service." Morrison's pen stopped moving across his manifest sheets. "Subject 17 spoke to you?" "Just a brief thank you, sir." Marshal Kearney immediately corrected the breach of protocol. "Good." Morrison set down his pen and studied Pearl's face with uncomfortable intensity. "Miss Hartwell, federal transport operations involve national security matters that extend far beyond railroad concerns. The passengers in Car 4 represent significant government interests, and their successful delivery to Chicago will benefit everyone involved." Pearl sensed an opportunity to probe deeper into the railroad's shadow operations. "Sir, may I ask what kind of national security matters require such elaborate transport arrangements?" Morrison glanced around the observation car to ensure their privacy before answering. "Some individuals possess information or abilities that make them valuable to multiple government agencies. Subject 17 falls into that category. Too important to eliminate, too dangerous to release, too sensitive for standard custody." The explanation raised more questions than it answered, but Pearl recognized the limits of Morrison's willingness to discuss classified operations. She would need to discover Subject 17's true identity and significance through more subtle investigation. "I understand, sir. Will there be additional special transports on future Night Express routes?" "Increasingly so." Morrison returned to his paperwork with obvious dismissal. "The railroad has entered into several federal contracts that will require expanded security measures and specialized personnel. Your promotion to senior conductor was based partly on those anticipated needs." Pearl left Morrison to his secret documents and returned to her quarters, where she opened her private journal and began recording everything she had observed about Subject 17 and his marshal escorts. The passengers' educated speech patterns, Kearney's nervous behavior, the muffled arguments from compartment 4A, all details that might prove significant when pieced together with future observations. But as she wrote by candlelight, Pearl became aware of footsteps in the corridor outside her quarters. Slow, deliberate steps that paused directly outside her door before continuing toward the rear of the train. Someone was conducting their own investigation of the Night Express's operations. She blew out her candle and listened carefully to the sounds beyond her compartment. The footsteps returned, accompanied by the subtle metallic clicks of lockpicks working against security mechanisms. Someone was attempting to breach the federal transport area using tools and techniques that suggested professional training. Pearl dressed quickly and slipped into the corridor, following the sounds toward Car 4 while staying in the shadows between electric light fixtures. She reached the service corridor entrance just as a figure in dark clothing disappeared through the restricted doorway. The intruder was tall and lean, moving with the fluid precision of someone accustomed to dangerous work. Pearl caught a glimpse of professional lockpicking tools and what appeared to be a military-style pistol holstered beneath a civilian coat. This wasn't a curious passenger or opportunistic thief. This was someone with specific objectives and the skills to achieve them. Pearl followed the intruder through the service corridor, her heart hammering against her ribs as she realized she was walking into a confrontation between federal marshals and an unknown adversary. But her journalist instincts demanded answers about Subject 17's identity, even if discovery meant death. The intruder had reached compartment 4B and was working on the reinforced lock with surgical precision. Pearl could see Marshal Kearney's boots beneath the compartment door, suggesting that the guard was asleep or unconscious. The other marshals in compartments 4A and 4C showed no signs of movement or awareness. Subject 17's voice came through the compartment door in urgent whispers. "Agent Morrison, is that you? Have you come to complete the extraction?" The intruder responded in equally quiet tones. "Negative. Extraction has been compromised. We need to eliminate the asset before Chicago arrival." Pearl's blood froze as she understood what she was witnessing. Subject 17 wasn't just a federal prisoner being transported for trial. He was a government asset being moved between agencies, and someone wanted him dead before he could testify about classified operations. The lock clicked open and the intruder slipped inside compartment 4B. Pearl heard the distinctive sound of a suppressed gunshot, followed by Subject 17's sharp intake of breath and the thud of a body hitting the floor. She had witnessed a federal execution aboard the Night Express, carried out by someone with official credentials and professional equipment. But instead of feeling terror, Pearl experienced a strange sense of clarity about her role in the railroad's conspiracy. The Night Express wasn't just carrying phantom passengers and federal prisoners. It was serving as a mobile execution chamber for government assets who had outlived their usefulness. Morrison's promotion and special assignments weren't recognition of her abilities. They were preparation for complicity in state-sanctioned murder. The intruder emerged from compartment 4B and spotted Pearl in the corridor shadows. Their eyes met across 10 feet of federal crime scene, and Pearl realized that her investigation of the railroad's secrets had just signed her death warrant. The assassin's hand moved toward his concealed weapon with professional smoothness, but Pearl Hartwell's trembling fingers found her conductor's whistle first. The shrill blast echoed through Car 4 like a banshee scream, shattering the silence that had covered Subject 17's execution. Emergency protocols demanded immediate response to conductor whistles, and Pearl prayed that someone aboard the Night Express still followed legitimate railroad regulations. "Federal emergency in Car 4!" she shouted at the top of her lungs, backing toward the service corridor exit while keeping her eyes locked on the assassin. "All crew members respond immediately." The killer hesitated, clearly weighing his options between eliminating a witness and maintaining operational secrecy. That moment of indecision gave Pearl the opening she needed to sprint through the service corridor and into regular passenger territory, where her screams would wake sleeping travelers and force the assassin to abandon stealth tactics. Behind her, she heard compartment doors slamming open as the remaining marshals discovered their colleague's unconscious body and Subject 17's corpse. Marshal voices erupted in confusion and anger, creating enough chaos to mask Pearl's escape, but not enough to guarantee her survival. She burst into Car 3's passenger section and found Jake Brennan stumbling from his sleeping quarters with tousled hair and confused eyes. "Miss Hartwell? What's happening?" "I heard the emergency whistle. Federal prisoner has been murdered," Pearl gasped, grabbing Brennan's shoulders with both trembling hands. "Armed assassin in Car 4. We need to alert the engineer and telegraph ahead to Chicago authorities." Brennan's face went pale as he processed the implications. "Jesus Christ. Should we evacuate the regular passengers?" Pearl's mind raced through tactical considerations while her body shook with adrenaline and terror. Evacuating passengers would create panic and confusion, making it easier for the assassin to blend into crowds and escape. But keeping innocent people aboard made them potential hostages or casualties in whatever confrontation was developing. No evacuation yet, she decided. But we need to secure the locomotive and establish communication with outside authorities. Can you handle the telegraph? Yes, ma'am. What about Conductor Morrison? Pearl's stomach clenched as she realized that Morrison might be complicit in Subject 17's execution. His knowledge of federal transport protocols, his emphasis on secrecy and discretion, his promotion of her to senior conductor, everything pointed toward railroad cooperation with the assassination. Don't inform Morrison until we know more about the situation, she said carefully. This might involve railroad personnel as well as federal agents. Brennan nodded and headed toward the telegraph compartment, while Pearl returned to Car 4, knowing that her survival depended on understanding the full scope of the conspiracy. The assassin had called Subject 17 an asset rather than a prisoner, suggesting government operations that extended beyond simple criminal transport. She approached the federal section carefully, listening for voices and movement that would indicate ongoing activity. The service corridor was empty, but she could hear Marshal Kearney's voice from compartment 4B speaking in urgent, clipped sentences that suggested radio communication with external command structures. Asset is confirmed eliminated. Extraction agent has vanished. Recommend immediate lockdown and passenger interrogation to identify potential witnesses. Pearl pressed herself against the corridor wall as footsteps approached from compartment 4A. Marshal Reynolds emerged with a military-style radio unit and scanning equipment designed to detect electronic surveillance devices. He was conducting a security sweep to identify anyone who might have witnessed the execution. "Kearney," Reynolds called. "Scanner shows electronic activity in Car 3. Someone's operating telegraph equipment." Pearl's blood turned cold as she realized that Brennan's attempt to contact outside authorities had revealed their location to the federal team. The marshals would converge on the telegraph compartment within minutes, and Jake's inexperience with dangerous situations would make him vulnerable to interrogation techniques that could expose Pearl's involvement. She needed to reach Brennan before the marshals did, but approaching Car 3 would require passing through areas under federal surveillance. The only alternative route was through the exterior connections between cars, a dangerous proposition on a train traveling 60 miles per hour through Kansas darkness. Pearl climbed through a maintenance hatch onto the Night Express's roof, where prairie wind whipped her conductor's uniform like battle flags. The train's motion was amplified at this height, swaying and bucking over track irregularities that threatened to throw her into the rushing darkness below. She crawled across Car 4's roof toward Car 3, using ventilation equipment and signal apparatus as handholds while trying to ignore the vast emptiness that surrounded the speeding train. Her left hand trembled violently in the cold air, but the physical challenge of roof navigation gave her something concrete to focus on, besides the growing certainty that she was trapped aboard a mobile execution chamber. The telegraph compartment's skylight glowed with warm yellow light as Brennan worked the transmission key with frantic energy. Pearl could see him hunched over the equipment, tapping out messages in railroad emergency code while glancing nervously at the compartment door. She dropped through an access hatch near the telegraph station and found Brennan just as Marshal Reynolds' footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. "Jake, step away from the telegraph immediately." Brennan looked up with relief flooding his young features. "Miss Hartwell, thank God. I've been trying to reach Chicago Dispatch, but something's jamming our transmissions. Every message gets cut off after a few words." Pearl realized that the federal team had brought electronic countermeasures designed to prevent communication with outside authorities. The Night Express was operating under complete communication blackout, making it impossible to summon help or report the assassination. "Federal marshals are conducting security sweeps," she whispered urgently. "They're looking for witnesses to Subject 17's murder. We need to hide before they reach this compartment." Reynolds's voice carried through the door as he approached their location. "Kearney, I've got the telegraph source. Prepare for passenger interrogation protocols." Pearl and Brennan looked around the small compartment for concealment options, but telegraph stations were designed for efficiency rather than security. The only hiding place was beneath the equipment table, barely large enough for one person and completely exposed to anyone entering the room. "Jake, listen carefully," Pearl whispered. "When they question you, say that you heard emergency whistles and came to check the telegraph for routine maintenance. Don't mention me, don't mention federal prisoners, and don't admit to sending any messages. What about you?" Pearl was already moving toward the compartment's rear exit, knowing that her only chance of survival lay in staying ahead of the federal sweep. "I'm going to find out who ordered Subject 17's execution and why the railroad is cooperating with government assassins." She slipped through the rear door just as Reynolds reached the telegraph compartment's main entrance. Behind her, she heard Jake trying to explain his presence with stammering nervousness that would immediately identify him as a potential witness. The federal team would interrogate him thoroughly, but Brennan's genuine ignorance about the assassination conspiracy would protect him better than any prepared alibi. Pearl made her way through Car 2 toward the locomotive, passing sleeping passengers who had no idea that murder had been committed 50 feet from their berths. The Night Express continued its journey toward Chicago with mechanical precision, following schedules and maintaining speeds as if carrying routine cargo rather than federal corpses and government assassins. She found Conductor Morrison in the locomotive cab, speaking quietly with Engineer Walsh while studying route maps and timetables. Both men looked up as she entered, their expressions showing surprise mixed with something that might have been guilt. "Miss Hartwell," Morrison said carefully. "I heard emergency whistles from Car 4. Is everything proceeding smoothly with the federal transport?" Pearl studied Morrison's face for signs of deception, while her left hand shook with nervous tension. "Subject 17 has been murdered by a professional assassin who had detailed knowledge of federal transport protocols. The killer referred to the victim as an asset rather than a prisoner." Morrison and Walsh exchanged glances that confirmed Pearl's suspicions about railroad complicity. They had known that Subject 17 was being transported for execution rather than trial, making them accessories to premeditated murder. "Miss Hartwell," Morrison said slowly, "federal transport operations sometimes involve national security matters that require extreme measures. The railroad's responsibility is to provide secure transportation, not to question government decisions about passenger welfare." "You knew," Pearl said flatly. "You knew that Subject 17 was being murdered tonight, and you promoted me to senior conductor to make me complicit in federal assassination." Morrison's expression hardened into the cold authority that had intimidated Pearl since her first day aboard the Night Express. "I promoted you because you demonstrated the intelligence and discretion necessary for sensitive railroad operations. What happens to federal passengers during transport is beyond railroad jurisdiction." Pearl felt the last pieces of the conspiracy falling into place. The Night Express served as a mobile execution chamber for government assets who possessed dangerous information, operating under railroad cover to avoid the legal complications of domestic assassination. Morrison's crew provided logistical support, while federal teams handled the actual killings. "How many people have been murdered aboard this train?" she demanded. "That information is classified above your clearance level," Morrison replied. "Your job is to count passengers, provide services, and maintain accurate records according to federal specifications. Nothing more complicated than that." Engineer Walsh spoke for the first time since Pearl's arrival. "Miss Hartwell, you need to understand that some passengers aboard the Night Express represent threats to national security. The government has legal authority to eliminate such threats through whatever means necessary." Pearl's trembling hand clenched into a fist as she realized the full scope of her entrapment. The railroad wasn't just falsifying passenger manifests, it was providing murder weapons disguised as transportation services. Her promotion to senior conductor had made her an accessory to crimes that could result in execution if discovered by hostile authorities. But her journalist instincts demanded evidence rather than speculation. She needed proof of the railroad's complicity, documentation that could expose the entire conspiracy if she survived long enough to reach outside authorities. "I understand my responsibilities," she told Morrison. "Subject 17 will be listed as completing the journey to Chicago, just like the phantom passenger from compartment 7A yesterday night." Morrison smiled with satisfaction, apparently believing that Pearl had accepted her role in the assassination conspiracy. "Excellent. Your discretion and accuracy will be noted in your personnel file." Pearl left the locomotive cab and returned to Car 4, where she found Marshal Kearney supervising the removal of Subject 17's body through exterior cargo hatches. The corpse was being loaded into a railroad refrigeration unit designed for transporting meat products, ensuring that no traces of the murder would remain visible to Chicago authorities. The federal execution protocol was proceeding with mechanical efficiency, eliminating evidence while creating documentation that would satisfy official inquiries. Subject 17 would disappear from government records as completely as he had vanished from the Night Express's passenger manifest. But Pearl had decided that some disappearances deserved permanent documentation, even if such records meant her own destruction. The Night Express pulled into Chicago Union Station as dawn painted the industrial skyline in shades of soot and gold. But Pearl Hartwell no longer recognized the train that had employed her for 8 months. She stood at the conductor's platform with her official clipboard, watching federal agents remove refrigerated cargo that had once been Subject 17, while regular passengers disembarked into the morning chaos of porters and steam. Her left hand trembled against the metal railing as she realized that today's passenger count would determine whether she lived or died. Marshal Kearney approached with his final transport documentation, his weathered face showing the strain of covering up a federal execution. "Miss Hartwell, I need your signature on the prisoner transfer forms. Subject 17 is being delivered to Chicago authorities as scheduled." Pearl studied the documents carefully, noting that they described Subject 17 as alive and cooperative during transport. The forms would create an official record showing successful delivery of a federal prisoner who had actually been murdered in compartment 4B12 hours earlier. "Marshal, these documents state that Subject 17 completed the journey in good health. Is that accurate?" Kearney's eyes hardened with warning. "Federal transport records reflect the successful completion of classified operations, Miss Hartwell. Subject 17 was delivered to appropriate authorities exactly as contracted." Pearl signed the forms with her trembling hand, officially documenting another phantom passenger for the Night Express's growing collection of ghosts. But this time, her complicity in federal murder came with a plan that might expose the entire conspiracy if she could survive long enough to implement it. Conductor Morrison appeared at her elbow as the last regular passengers departed the train. "Final count, Miss Hartwell? 18 regular passengers disembarked safely," Pearl reported. "Federal cargo was transferred to appropriate authorities without incident." "Excellent." Morrison consulted his pocket watch as depot workers began servicing the locomotive for its return journey. "Miss Hartwell, your performance during this transport operation has been noted by federal supervisors. They're offering you a permanent position with expanded responsibilities and significantly higher compensation." The offer felt like a golden noose being placed around her neck. Pearl understood that accepting promotion within the assassination conspiracy would make her indispensable to operations she couldn't escape, while refusing would mark her as a security risk requiring elimination. "What kind of expanded responsibilities, sir?" Morrison glanced around the depot platform to ensure their privacy before answering. "Senior Logistics Coordinator for Federal Transport Operations. You would oversee passenger manifests, crew assignments, and security protocols for the entire railroad network. The position includes housing, federal pension benefits, and legal immunity for classified activities." Pearl's mind raced through the implications while her body shook with nervous energy. The railroad was offering her complete protection from prosecution in exchange for managing their execution protocols on a national scale. She would become the administrator of American state murder, organizing ghost passengers and phantom manifests across dozens of train routes. "Sir, may I have time to consider such a significant career change?" Morrison's smile carried dangerous undertones. "Of course. Federal positions require careful consideration of all implications. Take the weekend to review your options, Miss Hartwell. We'll need your decision by Monday morning." The deadline was clear as Chicago winter air. Accept promotion to federal murder coordinator or face elimination as a security liability. Pearl had 72 hours to choose between complicity and death, assuming she could survive that long with the knowledge she now possessed. But as Morrison walked toward the station master's office, Pearl noticed a familiar figure watching their conversation from beside the baggage cars. Jake Brennan stood in the shadows with his conductor's uniform wrinkled and his young face marked by exhaustion and fear. Marshal Reynolds had released him after interrogation, but Brennan's eyes held knowledge that hadn't existed before his encounter with federal security protocols. Pearl approached carefully, unsure whether Brennan had been recruited into the conspiracy or marked for elimination. "Jake, are you all right? I heard the marshals questioned you about the telegraph transmissions." Brennan looked around nervously before speaking in urgent whispers. "Miss Hartwell, they didn't just question me. They showed me photographs and documents about previous night express operations. Dozens of passengers who boarded trains and never disembarked anywhere, all listed as completing their journeys in railroad records." Pearl's stomach clenched as she realized that the federal team had used Brennan's interrogation to reveal the full scope of the assassination conspiracy. They were forcing him to understand his role in government murder while documenting his reactions for future leverage. "What did they want you to do?" "They offered me a promotion to Federal Transport Coordinator, just like they offered you. Said the railroad needs young employees who understand the importance of national security operations." Brennan's hands shook as he pulled a sealed envelope from his uniform pocket. "They gave me this to deliver to you personally." Pearl took the envelope with growing dread, knowing that federal agencies communicated through official channels rather than personal messages. Whatever was written inside represented either recruitment or elimination, possibly both. She opened the envelope carefully and found a single sheet of government letterhead containing a brief message typed in official format. "Miss Hartwell, your journalist background and investigative instincts make you valuable for federal documentation projects. Report to Suite 1207, Palmer House Hotel, at 8 p.m. today for briefing on expanded responsibilities. Failure to appear will result in immediate termination of employment and related benefits. Agent Morrison, Federal Security Division." The message confirmed Pearl's worst fears about the conspiracy's reach. Agent Morrison wasn't just Morrison the conductor. He was a federal operative using railroad cover to coordinate assassination operations across the transportation network. Her promotion to senior conductor had been orchestrated by government agents who knew about her father's newspaper background and her inherited investigative abilities. "Jake," she said quietly, "did they give you a similar message?" Brennan nodded while his face went pale with terror. "Suite 1208, same time. They said we're being recruited for a special federal project that requires railroad experience and absolute loyalty." Pearl understood the federal strategy now. They were using the Night Express crew as recruitment targets, identifying employees with useful skills and either incorporating them into assassination operations or eliminating them as security risks. Tonight's meeting at the Palmer House would determine which category she and Brennan occupied. The rest of the morning passed in routine depot activities, but Pearl's mind focused on survival planning rather than railroad duties. She needed evidence of the federal conspiracy that could be transmitted to outside authorities before tonight's meeting, assuming such authorities still existed independently of the assassination network. During her lunch break, Pearl walked through Chicago's business district until she found the offices of the Chicago Tribune, where her father had worked as a correspondent before his death in the Great War. The newspaper might provide sanctuary and communication channels that remained outside federal control. The Tribune's city editor, a grizzled veteran named Patrick McMurphy, recognized Pearl's surname and welcomed her into his cluttered office overlooking Michigan Avenue. "Hartwell, eh? Your father wrote some damn fine pieces about railroad corruption back in 18. What brings his daughter to my newsroom?" Pearl studied McMurphy's weathered face, searching for signs of trustworthiness, while knowing that her survival might depend on accurately judging his character. "Mr. McMurphy, I have information about federal assassination operations using railroad transportation as cover. Multiple murders disguised as passenger transport, with government agents coordinating the killings." McMurphy's expression shifted from polite interest to intense focus. "That's a serious accusation, Miss Hartwell. What kind of evidence are you offering?" Pearl pulled out her private journal and placed it on McMurphy's desk. Detailed documentation of phantom passengers, falsified manifests, and federal execution protocols aboard the Pennsylvania Railroad's Night Express. Names, dates, locations, and witness testimony about government murder operations. McMurphy opened the journal and read several pages with growing amazement. "Jesus Christ, girl. If this is accurate, you're describing a domestic assassination program that violates every constitutional protection we've got left." "It's accurate, sir. I've witnessed federal executions personally and participated in covering up the evidence. Tonight, government agents are attempting to recruit me into managing these operations on a national scale." McMurphy closed the journal and locked it in his desk drawer. "Miss Hartwell, this information needs to reach people with the authority and resources to investigate federal crimes. I'm going to contact Senator Wheeler's office immediately. He chairs the Committee on Railroad Regulation and has been asking questions about federal transportation contracts." Pearl felt hope stirring in her chest for the first time since discovering Subject 17's corpse. "Sir, the federal agents have given me until Monday morning to accept their recruitment offer. If I refuse, they'll eliminate me as a security risk. Then we need to move fast." McMurphy reached for his telephone and began dialing Washington numbers. "Senator Wheeler has been investigating rumors about government assassination programs for months. Your evidence might be exactly what he needs to expose the entire conspiracy." But as McMurphy spoke with congressional offices, Pearl noticed movement in the street below his window. Black automobiles with government license plates were positioning themselves around the Tribune building, creating a surveillance perimeter that suggested federal awareness of her location. "Mr. McMurphy," she interrupted. "Federal agents are surrounding the building. They've tracked me here." McMurphy looked through his window and cursed under his breath. "Damn, they work fast when their operations are threatened." He handed Pearl a business card with handwritten notes on the back. "That's Senator Wheeler's private telegraph address and emergency telephone number. If something happens to me, get your evidence to his office by any means necessary." Pearl pocketed the card as footsteps echoed in the Tribune's main corridor, moving with the measured pace of professional agents conducting building searches. Federal security had located her refuge and was preparing to eliminate both her and the evidence she had provided. "Is there another way out of this building?" McMurphy opened his office safe and removed a revolver, along with several boxes of ammunition. "Fire escape leads to the alley behind Clark Street. Take this. You'll need protection before this day is over." Pearl accepted the weapon despite her trembling hands making accurate shooting unlikely. The revolver's weight felt foreign and dangerous, but less threatening than facing federal assassins without any means of defense. The footsteps reached McMurphy's corridor as Pearl climbed through his office window onto the fire escape overlooking Chicago's industrial district. Behind her, she heard the door splintering under federal battering rams, and McMurphy's voice raised in angry protest about press freedom and constitutional rights. She descended the fire escape rapidly while gunshots erupted from McMurphy's office, knowing that her evidence had just cost another innocent person his life. The federal conspiracy was eliminating witnesses with mechanical efficiency, but Pearl's journal remained locked in McMurphy's desk, where government agents would discover it within minutes. The hunt for truth had become a race for survival, and Pearl was running out of places to hide. Pearl Hartwell crouched in the Chicago Tribune's back alley as federal agents swarmed the building above her, their boots hammering against floors where Patrick McMurphy's body now lay cooling beside his desk. The revolver in her trembling left hand felt like a child's toy against the professional assassination team that had eliminated the newspaper editor. But she gripped it anyway as sirens wailed across the industrial district. Her private journal remained locked in McMurphy's safe, useless now that government agents controlled the crime scene and would destroy any evidence of their domestic murder operations. But Pearl's father had taught her that good journalists always kept multiple copies of important stories, and she had prepared for this possibility during her lunch break. A duplicate set of documents waited in a Western Union envelope addressed to Senator Wheeler's Washington office, already paid for and scheduled for transmission at 6 p.m. regardless of her personal survival. The question now was whether she could stay alive long enough for congressional investigation to matter. She made her way through Chicago's maze of service alleys and freight yards, using railroad knowledge to navigate industrial areas where federal agents would have difficulty tracking her movements. The city's transportation infrastructure provided dozens of hiding places for someone who understood switching schedules, cargo routing, and maintenance protocols. At 4 p.m., Pearl reached the Illinois Central Freight Depot, where she found Jake Brennan loading baggage with mechanical precision while his young face showed the strain of impending federal recruitment. He looked up as she approached, relief flooding his features when he recognized her silhouette against the loading dock's harsh lighting. "Miss Hartwell, thank God you're alive. Federal agents came looking for you at the depot this morning, asking questions about your whereabouts and loyalty to railroad operations." Pearl glanced around the freight yard to ensure their privacy before responding. "Jake, the federal meeting tonight isn't recruitment, it's elimination. They're planning to kill us both to prevent testimony about the assassination operations." Brennan's hands shook as he processed the implications. "But they offered promotions and federal pensions. Why would they murder railroad employees who could help with their operations? Because we know too much about their methods and have demonstrated investigative instincts that make us security risks." Pearl showed him McMurphy's business card, with Senator Wheeler's contact information. "Congressional investigators are already asking questions about federal transportation contracts. Our testimony could expose the entire conspiracy." Brennan studied the card carefully, while his breathing became rapid and shallow. "Miss Hartwell, if we contact congressional offices, the federal agents will know immediately. Government telephone lines are monitored, telegraph systems are controlled, and even postal services report suspicious activities." Pearl had already considered these obstacles during her flight through Chicago's alleys. "There's one communication method they can't monitor or control: direct testimony before congressional investigators who are already suspicious of federal operations. How do we reach Washington without using monitored transportation?" Pearl smiled for the first time since discovering Subject 17's corpse, finally seeing a path through the federal conspiracy that might preserve both their lives and their evidence. "We don't go to Washington, Jake. We bring Washington to Chicago." She explained her plan while they worked together loading freight cars with legitimate cargo that would provide cover for their evening activities. Senator Wheeler maintained investigative offices in Chicago's federal building, and congressional staff members conducted regular interviews with witnesses who possessed information about government misconduct. Pearl's evidence about railroad assassination operations would interest investigators who were already questioning federal transportation policies. At 6 p.m., as scheduled, her duplicate documentation began transmitting to Senator Wheeler's Washington office through Western Union channels that operated independently of railroad and federal communication networks. The evidence would reach congressional investigators regardless of what happened to Pearl and Brennan during their confrontation with government assassins. But survival required more than documentary evidence. It demanded allies with official authority and resources sufficient to challenge federal murder operations. Pearl had identified such allies during her research into congressional railroad investigations, and tonight would determine whether constitutional government still functioned in America or had been completely replaced by executive assassination programs. At 7:30 p.m., Pearl and Brennan approached the Palmer House Hotel through service entrances that provided access to upper floors without passing through lobby areas under federal surveillance. They carried concealed weapons and documentation that could expose government crimes, but their real protection came from congressional investigators who were already positioned in adjacent suites, waiting for testimony about federal transportation misconduct. Senator Wheeler's Chicago staff had responded to Pearl's evidence with immediate interest, dispatching investigators and court reporters to document witness testimony before federal agents could eliminate potential witnesses. The constitutional system was fighting back against domestic assassination programs, using legal authority to protect citizens from their own government. Pearl knocked on the door of Suite 1207 at precisely 8 p.m., knowing that federal agents waited inside with execution orders, but also knowing that congressional investigators occupied Suite 1205 with subpoena powers and federal marshals loyal to legislative rather than executive authority. Agent Morrison opened the door with his familiar weathered face, now showing the cold professionalism of someone prepared to commit murder in service of national security. Behind him stood 3 other federal agents with weapons drawn and silencers attached, creating an execution chamber disguised as a hotel suite. Miss Hartwell, Mr. Brennan, please come in. We have important matters to discuss regarding your future with federal transportation operations. Pearl entered the suite with her left hand trembling violently, but her voice steady with journalist determination. Agent Morrison, before we discuss my future, I need to understand the scope of federal assassination operations using railroad transportation as cover. Morrison's expression shifted from professional courtesy to dangerous suspicion. Ms. Hartwell, your questions suggest a fundamental misunderstanding of your role in these operations. You are here to receive instructions, not to conduct interviews. Actually, came a voice from the suite's connecting door, she's here to provide testimony to congressional investigators about federal crimes committed aboard interstate transportation systems. Senator Burton Wheeler stepped into the execution chamber, flanked by 2 federal marshals, whose loyalty belonged to legislative rather than executive authority. The constitutional system had arrived to confront domestic assassination programs, bringing legal process to challenge government murder. Morrison and his team found themselves facing congressional subpoena power backed by federal marshals who outranked executive branch operatives. The assassination conspiracy had been trapped by the same legal structures they had sought to circumvent through railroad cover operations. Senator Wheeler, Morrison said carefully, federal transportation security operations are classified above congressional oversight levels. Wheeler smiled with the cold satisfaction of someone who had spent months preparing for this confrontation. Agent Morrison, no federal operations are classified above constitutional authority. Congressional investigators have full jurisdiction over interstate transportation systems, including criminal activities conducted by government employees. The next hour transformed into a constitutional crisis played out in a Chicago hotel suite, with Pearl providing detailed testimony about federal assassination operations, while Morrison's team faced arrest warrants issued by congressional authority. The evidence she had documented over months of night express operations became the foundation for investigations that would expose government murder programs and restore legal constraints on executive power. But the real transformation occurred when Wheeler asked Pearl to join congressional staff as a special investigator for federal transportation crimes, offering her the opportunity to pursue truth through legal channels rather than personal survival. Her trembling hand finally steadied as she accepted legitimate authority to investigate government misconduct. Ms. Hartwell, Wheeler said, as federal marshals escorted Morrison's team toward cells in Chicago's federal building. Your courage in documenting these crimes has preserved constitutional government when executive power threatened to eliminate legal constraints entirely. 6 months later, Pearl stood on the platform at Chicago Union Station as congressional investigators boarded a fully documented Pennsylvania Railroad train bound for Washington with evidence that would reshape federal law enforcement. The Night Express no longer carried phantom passengers or assassination targets, but operated under congressional oversight that required accurate manifests and legitimate passengers. Her left hand had stopped trembling entirely once she accepted her role as special investigator for congressional railroad oversight, a position that combined her journalist instincts with federal authority to pursue truth wherever it led. The railroad had taught her to count every passenger accurately, and she now applied that skill to counting government crimes with mathematical precision. Jake Brennan served as her chief assistant, having discovered that investigating federal misconduct provided more satisfaction than facilitating government murder. Together, they documented transportation crimes across the national railroad network, ensuring that no passenger would disappear into phantom manifests again. The constitutional system had survived its confrontation with domestic assassination programs, but Pearl understood that eternal vigilance remained necessary to prevent future abuses. Federal power would always seek to eliminate constraints, and citizens would always need to maintain accurate counts of government behavior. As the congressional train departed for Washington, Pearl opened her official investigation journal and began documenting new cases of federal transportation misconduct. Her trembling hand had become a steady instrument of constitutional justice, counting every crime and every criminal with the precision that democracy demanded. The Night Express continued operating under its original mission, carrying passengers safely from departure to destination with accurate records and legitimate service. But now congressional oversight ensured that every soul aboard received protection under law rather than execution under secrecy. The hunt for truth had transformed into institutionalized investigation, and America's transportation systems once again served citizens rather than assassins. Pearl's personal nightmare had become the foundation for structural reform that would protect future generations from government murder disguised as railroad service. The mathematics of democracy had prevailed over the arithmetic of assassination, and every passenger counted equally under constitutional law.